G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. The midness of the day. And after the midday news, we're going to listen to Geraldine Doog looking into the stories which have been emerging with increasing frequency, solidity and credibility to the effect that elements of the Royal Australian Army's Special Air Services have conducted themselves badly in Afghanistan in particular. Um, Not one incident, not two or three incidents. There's been a 4-year inquiry underway and they're now up to 50 something incidents. There's a person who was awarded the Victoria Cross for gallantry and bravery who's suing a journalist for slander, libel and defamation. So I'll have a bit of a chat outlining my thoughts after the broadcast.
Hello and welcome to Extra with me, Geraldine Doog. Delighted to have your company. Each week we'll bring you the best of Saturday Extra so that you can hear particularly the last hour of our show, which always has a range of interviews, big and small, and I hope you enjoy this collection of our best of Saturday Extra. A little bit later this hour, we're going to look at who creates the jobs that we're going to be working in and our children are in the future. And it might surprise you where the real action is. And also the Clinton years. It's 20 years ago, believe it or not, that another set of dramas dominated headlines about the US and the US politics. Well, we'll talk to a woman who has made a documentary about this. Blair Foster is her name, and I hope you can stay to hear her. But first to whether our elite soldiers do or don't act on our behalf in theatres of war. For 4 years now, the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force has been conducting an inquiry into claims that elite Australian troops killed unarmed Afghan men and children. The inquiry is looking into 55 separate incidents of alleged breaches of the rules of war in Afghanistan between 2005 and 16, the latest just coming this week, that story. Simultaneously, journalists at the ABC and Nine have uncovered a string of disturbing incidents which could qualify as war crimes perpetrated by some in special forces. So what has gone wrong and why do these stories keep emerging? Investigative journalist and author Chris Masters has spent many years reporting on Australia's special forces and their role in Afghanistan. I'm delighted he can join me now from his home. Chris Masters, hello and welcome.
Good morning, Geraldine.
What point is the official inquiry at, Chris? Is there a date when it will hand its final report to the Chief of the Defence Forces, Angus Campbell?
I don't think there's an exact date. We've been expecting it for probably even 3.5 years. It goes to show that, you don't have an inquiry for 4 years if it's into nothing. And initially, people were claiming that was the case. It was just looking into rumours. I'm confident that is not so, and I think many members of the public have seen evidence for themselves. Witnessed the recent Four Corners program where we see an apparently unarmed man representing no threat being shot down in a field. I think that this has been an extremely difficult inquiry, and that's the best explanation for why it's taken so long. Maybe it will be reporting in the next month, so I'm not sure.
And the man who is conducting the report, Justice Brereton, is himself a reservist, isn't he? He's a Major General in the reserves.
Yes, he's a distinguished appeals court judge as well as a Major General in the reserves.
Are these isolated cases? I know you're not going to go into the specifics, and you yourself, of course, are being sued by Ben Roberts-Smith, a VC winner at the moment, so we'll be careful of the legalities. But are these isolated cases, or are they indicative of a wider culture, would you say, in special forces?
I think it's true that it's isolated, but it's also true that there are systemic elements to this. I thought in the beginning that it was just likely to be rogue players. Don't forget that this has been called out by the operators themselves. I mean, we wouldn't know about this but for the fact that many of them have said, no, come on, Australian soldiers don't do that sort of stuff. But yeah, the buck's got to stop somewhere. You've got to think, well, as the Special Operations Commander Adam Finlay was recently quoted saying to his men in Perth, this was a failure of moral leadership. Well, something went wrong, and I think at the very top, the strategic purpose of Afghanistan, the importance of the maintenance of human rights and the preservation of a proud Australian record, somehow some vigilance was lost in that regard. It was an extraordinarily difficult conflict. It dragged on for so long, 12 years. It became dehumanizing, and I was there myself in 2011. At that point, people were saying it shouldn't be a surprise that it's going so wrong, because I think the metric for success became a rather abstract one. We'll just make this country a safer place for its inhabitants and then get out of here with as much dignity as we can. And for some of the operators on the ground, and I think the Special Forces people are different too. Don't forget that we had conventional forces over there for a long time engaged in the same difficult struggle, and war crimes allegations don't attach themselves to them. I think that the nature of Special Forces being so secretive and somewhat of a law unto themselves meant that many of them perhaps fell into a trap of seeing that the best metric for success was simply killing other people, and that, it seems to me, meant killing some of the people that we were there to protect.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about them then, these elite units, the Special Forces. Who makes up the Special Forces? How are they chosen?
The Special Forces are special, and they're very impressive. The main kinetic elements are SASR from Perth. People have heard of the SAS. The commandos are also a big fighting unit based on the East Coast.
The commandos, that's a separate...
The commandos, yeah. The 2nd Commando Regiment is based at Holsworthy, and the 1st Commando Regiment, which is a reservist regiment, has units in Sydney and Melbourne. Then you have an engineering regiment as well, and behind that, you have logistics support and aviation support, etc.
And what's the chain of command? I mean, who do they answer to? Who determines their missions?
Well, they're supposed to be part of the Australian Defence Force, and this perhaps is where some of the things went wrong, as I've come to reflect. They do have autonomy. They do operate separate to the conventional chain of command, and that's generally seen as a good thing. It makes them swift, efficient, it makes them self-contained. But in Afghanistan, they had very little to do with conventional forces. I know when I was there, and I'm the only reporter to have actually worked within the Special Forces compound, many conventional forces weren't allowed in there at all. I remember a commanding officer telling me that he didn't have the code to the gate. He couldn't go to places that I was going. They do. There's a trap that they can fall into of plain and simple hubris, that they think that they're so good and so special that they don't have to take notice of the conventional chain of command. There's a bit of a feeling that the foreign elements, but most particularly the Americans, became quite influential. They worked with the Americans, they wanted the approval of the Americans, and some people would say that towards the end of the conflict, they were taking more notice of the Americans than they were of their own chain of command.
And what was the difference with the Americans? I mean, how would that have subtly might that have affected the culture?
Well, I think all of them become captured by this kill culture. And in Special Forces, the really sexy operators are the SEAL Team 6 type, kill squads. And I think perhaps many of them identified with that personality subset in Special Forces, whereas there's a wide subset. I mean, initially, our Special Forces, and SASR in particular, were seen as the sort of the ghosts of the battlefield who are never seen but extremely influential. As they would often say, the shot that's not fired is more important than the one that is. And Geraldine, I really should say, I mean, I've been critical, obviously, and I don't want to give the sense that they were all like that. I mean, of course they weren't. The great majority weren't, and some of the best among them, this is a terrible story for Australia, but if there's a good side to it, it's that, yes, plenty of them that were in there could see bad things going on and called it out. And indeed, the ADF has done the same. They've stuck with this difficult inquiry.
Yes, you've been writing. Also, you did write, along with Nick McKenzie, about the role of the British Special Forces. This is another one that was subtly, I think you suggest, could have had an impact on the sensibility, shall we say, of some of these people, because they had been really hardened in Northern Ireland too, hadn't they?
That's right. I mean, look, Australians are pretty good at doing the wrong thing too. We can't sort of shift the blame, but there is a theory that this blooding culture, if you look at what went wrong, it's probably in three major categories. One is just plain and simple summary executions. Two is sort of disguising the evidence on the battlefield, with dropping throwdowns to pretend that a civilian who might have been killed was actually a combatant. And another was blooding, the notion that they blooded younger soldiers to get them used to the idea of killing, which of course is a core business. It's what many of them are meant to do. And there's a theory that some of that was imported from foreign forces.
Well, in fact, that goes to an important thing about investigations, because there were people put in to investigate from time to time, weren't they? But they seem to have been given short shrift. And certainly their results don't conform with what we're now seeing.
I know. I think that's come as a surprise to a lot of people, and even some of the commanders that were on the ground. I mean, I think many of them were doing a good job and believed they were doing a good job. And then when they see this stuff on television, it comes as a hell of a shock to them as well. So somebody had their eye off the ball, and it was extremely difficult for the investigators who were sent in. Would
they have been regular army, would they, or would they have been from within?
Well, they weren't Special Forces,
no.
and that makes a big difference, I think. They tend to respect and talk to one another. They often weren't allowed to go to the scenes of the crime, so to speak, because it was just too dangerous. And these SF people are extremely good at covering their tracks. I mean, their business is being secret, and this is another reason why this inquiry has gone on for so long. I mean, so many of these people are not just secretive, but they're trained in resisting interrogation. So I think when those investigators came in and started asking questions, it was pretty easy for the wool to be pulled over certain people's eyes.
Chris Masters is my guest, and one text has just come in along this line. Many Army senior officers were serving in national command and operational positions in the Middle East when these incidents occurred. What did they know? What did they ask? Not just soldiers committing crimes here, but questions need to be asked of still serving senior officials. Chris Masters ought to know this. How do you respond to that?
Yes, well, I did say that the buck stops somewhere, and I don't think command is in any way off the hook. The Inspector General will report, and as I said, also the current Special Operations Commander has talked about a failure of moral leadership. I mean, historically, I think that's another tough reason for the diggers themselves. They often feel the officers get away with this stuff, that the blame sort of ends up falling on them. I really don't think that will be the case in this. I'm sure that the ADF and the Inspector General is looking hard at what went wrong within the chain of command.
I know that there are some thoughts in parts of the broader military that if this report is serious enough, that there might have to be dramatic thoughts taken about disbanding it and starting up again, building a culture from the ground up, as is happening in some of the police forces, for instance, in the US. That is now occurring. When you've got a culture that, even if it is a small subset of the culture, which is sort of so changed that you can't work with it, and you've got to scuttle it and begin again, which is an incredibly big thing. I'm suggesting, I know now, and it'd be a huge decision. But have you heard any talk like that?
You do hear that talk. I mean, the very role of special forces evolves so much that there'd be arguments for adjustments anyway. Most of what occurred a long time ago. If there are perpetrators, the great majority of them aren't now serving. There is a strong example from Canada of their elite paratrooper people being disbanded after an atrocity in, I think it was 1993 in Somalia, where a kid was beaten to death, and so that's exactly what they did, Geraldine. They tore up the whole game and started again. I doubt that will be the case for some of the reasons that I outlined already. SASR in Perth in particular is a very proud regiment and a very valuable regiment. But of course, lots of things need to be fixed, and we've got an eye on different issues these days to those that occurred when we went into Afghanistan in 2001. And I think there'd be a strong sense that those skill sets are still important, but have to be managed. You have to keep the attack dog on the leash.
Yes, I think in your writing you've suggested that clearly what you've gleaned is there is a belief that there's 10 or 12 officers who are probably at the core of this, as it were. So I suppose that's still it's not a small number, but it's not. And obviously there were, as you say, people from within those units who, by the sound of you, the people who have taken that footage and made it available to the media, they're quite remarkable in their own way too.
I think so too. I mean, they get medals for physical courage, but moral courage is often far more impressive. And I think it's been extremely difficult for those operators who've called out other operators. And there's a damn good chance that they'll never be thanked for it. But as a nation, I think it's important that we do thank them, because standards are important. A lot of people will say, well, why care about this? What goes on the battlefield can stay there. War is an ugly, messy business. But as best I understand, we've never been talking about heat of battle, spur of the moment misjudgments. We've been talking about much worse than that, and we've got every right to be proud of the Australian soldier, and we don't want them to behave to standards that aren't ours. We don't want them behaving like Nazis.
Has this damaged our reputation internationally in this field?
Well, yes and no. I mean, of course, it's uncomfortable reading, but on the other hand, it has been called out. I mean, a lot of countries would be tempted by the cover-up. We've seen other scandals, similar scandals, by the way, in the UK and the US, and it did seem to me that the UK just didn't want to go there. And in the United States, Donald Trump has actually exonerated a couple of people who were charged with war crimes. I'd like to think Australia will be better than that.
It was a nasty war. And it is true. So there might be people listening and saying, really, people sitting listening to their radios have got no idea what we had to go through. And for instance, there was quite a lot of attention paid to this issue of Afghan spotters. So not your regular fighters, but people who called fighters in, for want of a better term, who sent out messages, who often were unarmed, as I understand it. And that's been one of the answers. Now, do you have any sympathy with that?
I absolutely do, and I saw it for myself. That split-second decision that you make on the battlefield as to whether this person's a combatant or not. You know, there were situations where a farmer would pick up a rifle and become an insurgent and then put the rifle down and pick up a hoe and work in the middle of the field. And people watched this, you know. They watched children being appropriated onto the battlefield, carrying weapons, etc., etc. And soldiers would sit and watch a child race across and pick up a weapon and bring that back to someone else. As far as the spotters were concerned, it was a difficult call. I mean, if they weren't a combatant, but they were able to call in a strike on an approaching helicopter via a radio, you know, they clearly represented a serious threat. So, and from the comfort of our lounge chairs, that is a difficult thing to understand, and I think we need to be forgiving to a degree too. But again, I say, these inquiries aren't about matters like that.
No, but John Newsom, for instance, has in the past posed the question, how much can we expect from the inquiry? It is a case of the ADF inspecting itself, isn't it?
It is. It is, and you might see that there would always be problems there, and Special Forces people have a history and habit of covering things up and making sure that only the good stories get out. So there are concerns in that regard, but I mean, I don't have them. I watching over the fence, the Inspector General inquiry at work, it seems to me that they seem to be determined to get to the bottom of this.
Any response, by the way, from Afghanistan? Final question to you about these revelations. I mean, has the Afghan government had anything to say?
I don't know, and I don't think so. The people have, of course. A lot of people have been over there interviewing witnesses, etc. I think some of the operators who might have done the bad thing 10 or 12 years ago never imagined that people would be going back and asking questions in these places. But I could see circumstances where it was no wonder they ended up hating us. And Geraldine, this is an important point. I mean, it was obviously morally wrong to be killing unarmed civilians, but it was strategically terribly wrong as well, because we were just ruining our own difficult efforts.
Chris Masters, very good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geraldine.
Chris Masters, the author of several books, including No Front Line, Australian Special Forces at War in Afghanistan, and I can see several texts have come through too, and if I have the time, I shall read some of them. Well,
and I'll sit here with the camera on pause and wait till she reads them, because some of them are pretty good.
New South Wales Jobs for the Future 2016 was entirely about new firms who created all the 1 million jobs over the previous.
Damn, wrong text message.
Extra with me, Geraldine Doogue.
There you go. By the luck of the draw, the segment of text messages back in response to the main feature item of the day. The 12 rotten officers of the Australian Special Air Services Regiment who participated, enabled, facilitated, covered up 56, I think they said, incidents which have currently been investigated for as long as 4 years by a major with judicial background, I think an appeals court judge, who's a major in the Army Reserve. Don't know whether they said he was a previous Special Air Service regimentarian. But yeah, he's bright enough not to have the wool pulled over his eyes by the people who apparently pulled the wool over the eyes of the first 10, 15 years worth of investigators. I think the fact that a Victoria Cross winner is suing a journalist for covering the fact that he's one of the people being investigated, I think that's deeply alarming. I think it it means he's entrenching. He's not accepting the fact that he might have ever done anything wrong. He's perhaps a victim of the American Medal of Honour culture, wherein that nobody who is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honour can ever be court-martialed ever again. They also get a generous pension for life, and they and their immediate family have unlimited travel on any Department of Defence aircraft going anywhere. If they turn up and they say, here's my Congressional Medal of Honour, I want a seat on that aeroplane, they get it free for life. But they can't be court-martialed no matter what they do. So maybe the Special Air Services Victoria Cross recipient thinks that he got the Victoria Cross for doing something conspicuously brave and daring, an act of actual daring do in Absurdistan. I think he ran uphill into machine gun fire and thereby saved the lives of a bunch of his companions. If it turns out that he also ran around killing civilians because he just actually liked killing, then it means that he may perhaps, and bear in mind you can't ask a defamatory question, is it possible that he may be one of these sociopaths or psychopaths who don't actually feel fear? They just like killing. But maybe perhaps the idea of having a machine gun to shoot back at him gave him a heightened thrill of the kill. Is that possible, perhaps? A big question is, do we want people to be rewarded with the highest bravery recognition that the British Commonwealth Imperial realm can bestow if it's not actually an act of bravery for them because they like the thrill of the kill, and hunting humans is better fun than any other animal on the planet? Is that a reasonable thing? Do we want to hold these people up for adulation and admiration as an example for little Australians to aspire towards? I mean, the idea of running around while occupying Absurdistan, the graveyard of empires, and spontaneously killing civilians. There was one bit of helmet cam footage where the person who was killed was A, a civilian, B, unarmed, C, lying down on the ground, having surrendered, crying. There's another one where the person who was killed by our glorious, heroic Australian Special Air Services operators, they're not called soldiers, they're not called troops, operators, Special Air Service operators, killed a retarded goat herd. Not in the heat of battle, just because he liked killing. I mean, this is more like the SS Einsatzgruppen, Go out and kill anybody who looks wrong. You get a medal for it later. Kill them dead or win a medal, okay? This is not what Australia pays its taxes to be represented by. We don't actually agree to export Australians wearing our uniform, waving our flags, carrying death machines that we paid for, firing death seeds that we paid for across foreign landscapes, unless they stick right carefully within the limits of the rules of engagement. And a big one when you're trying to occupy a foreign country that's had experience at defeating 3 empires in the past, you don't take out your frustrations on the local civilians, because that turns the civilians against you. Jesus, didn't you listen to your bloody uncles when they were coming home from Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s? God almighty. Anybody you'd think you didn't have anybody closely related who was a warrant officer with the Army Advisory Corps leading Montagnards. Don't you people know anything? I think I might have been 9 or 10 years old when Uncle Mac, my second cousin, told me about the difficulty in dealing with kids younger than me running towards him across the street and not knowing whether they had a hand grenade with the pin pulled behind their back, and having to shoot them when they got right in close because, somebody got it behind them far enough to be able to see that they did in fact have a grenade. So, yeah, all that stuff that the man said about children being used to assist the guerrilla fighters defending their homeland against foreign invaders, yeah, it's all true. It all makes it very difficult. In Vietnam, they had rules of engagement which said that a local national who was standing still was a civilian and couldn't be shot at. If they were walking, they were a civilian and couldn't be shot at. If they were running, they were Viet Cong, and you got points in the game for shooting them and knocking them over. Stand still, will you? Better do that. But yeah, I just find this alarming, particularly the idea that it went on from 2005 to 2016. And I find it curiously gratifying and enlightening that one of the major ways that this eventually came to light was not that the Special Air Service personnel ratted on each other, quote unquote, to use the vernacular, dogged on each other, went to the authorities and told, little Johnny did this in the bottom of the playground sandpit when no one of the teachers were looking. No, what happened was the people who were support troops, like an army radio operator does a SAS affiliation short course so that they can keep up with the SAS, and they run around carrying the radio for them. People like that who are operating with the SAS, they came home having seen all this stuff, and they were kind of like a fish out of water in somebody else's command chain, and all of the people that they were surrounded by seemed to think it was normal, so they just had to shut up about it and bottle it in and hold it. And they came home, and then they went doolally tap splat from the post-traumatic stress disorder, not of what they had done, but what they had seen Australian soldiers doing. Operators, mate. SAS, operators. Because I've been on operations, see? Operational. Everything's operational. So you're an operator. Fucking World War II delusions of ancestor worship. Right, operational missions in your logbook in red, mate. They're not like normal flights. Might be some blood involved. Operations, operator. Yeah, the kill culture that journalist was talking about, it's definitely bloody in there. And it go on for hours about epigenetics and how combat veterans' children have 3 times the background suicide rate plus 1.8 times the background death by accident rate plus 1.2 times the death by illness rate of normal people's children, as discovered by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Statistics, 1998-2000. Yeah, like the idea that military veterans and combat veterans' children often grow up to think that the cleverest thing they can do is join the military and go out there and get on the battlefield and have a chance to play on the two-way rifle range and see whether they're really brave or not. I'm still having trouble with the idea that 12 officers in the SAS and 56 incidents, it's like, each one of those rotten officers has let 4 or 4.5 bad shit things go through in front of them over 11 or 12 years. Anyway, interesting also that Canada managed to clean up such a purulent pocket of infection in their special services by just dismantling the whole thing. That's it. You're out. Whole bloody lot of you. Go off and learn to make a living in the civilian world, and we'll recruit a whole new bunch of people, and we'll start teaching them from the very beginning, and we'll teach them morals and ethics and shit. I don't understand quite why people were saying that it might be the British SAS that got the Australians involved in doing bad crap like that, because I don't think the British SAS has taught the Australians anything about being in the SAS since Malaya. That's when the Australians were operating under British command and instruction, And that's when the Australian SAS got its start, before Vietnam, in Malaya, from what I can remember reading of it anyway. One of the reasons when Australians SAS went to Afghanistan, one of the reasons they didn't, how does this work? They didn't do as well against the Afghans as they expected to, is because the Mujahideen had been trained by the British Special Air Services more recently than the Australian Special Air Services had been trained by the British Special Air Services. So it meant that the Afghan Mujahideen, they had all effectively read the British textbook, the same textbook the Australians had. So everything the Australians tried kind of backfired because the counter move was already known by their enemy. The Taliban grew kind of with Al-Qaeda out of the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were the people who the Americans were funding for the British to train in order to defeat the Russians. Graveyard of empires. They don't call it that for nothing. They defeated the British Empire, they defeated the Russian Empire, they defeated the American Empire, and Australia wanted to get involved with that. Acting like America's pet attack trained chihuahua. And here's the thing. We might be America's pet attack trained chihuahua. We always go rushing in, yap, 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 committing to theatres of conflict before America does, so that America's got somebody to stand beside it and say, oh, look, like the Australians are already in there, so we better go and give them a hand. Look it up. Look it up. Vietnam, Iran, Afghanistan, like it's what we do. But when the Americans have a bloody massacre, they court-martialed Lieutenant Kelly. They didn't give him the Congressional Medal of Honour. How come we've got a Congressional Medal of Honour veteran in the crosshairs for war crimes? Like, that's... How many members of the SS got given the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaf swords and diamonds, eh? SAS Victoria Cross winner, investigated for war crimes. There was a justice of the New South Wales Supreme Court. Forget his name. It'll probably come back to me. Not quite Epstein, but close to that. Anyway, this fella retired, and when he retired, I asked him what was his takeaway message about slander, libel and defamation cases, and he said it was enormously expensive, and the bottom line was that 90% of successful applicants emerged from proceedings wishing that they had never ever commenced proceedings, because even though they won, they drew so much extra attention to the issue which would otherwise have been completely forgotten, sunk, submerged in the flow of other more interesting, more current, more contemporary scandals, that it cost them a heap of money to go to court, took up their lives for years, and even if they won, whatever they won didn't ever make up for the self-inflicted foot thrust, to put it in fencing terms. That's the one where the swordsman nails their own foot to the floorboards, holding themselves still for their own throat to be cut. So yeah, I think even if you are a Victoria Cross medal winner and your name comes up in an investigation into war crimes, the last bloody thing you could do to further your own cause would be to sue the journalists for daring to talk about it. And this has happened across Liberal and Labor governments. It's not something you can sheet home to either particular side of politics. This is kind of like the generic effect of going to war on the other side of the world in order to rack up goody points on the Pentagon scoreboard, in the hope that if ever Australia needs to be defended from the communists, aka the yellow perils to the north, then America will come and help us out because we're white, right-wing, racist Christian countries together, standing in the face of the Japanese Armada kind of thing. Ah, dear, oh dear, oh dear. Yay, Team Gaia hypothesis. All hail the Bat Eater's Lament virus. Measures are in hand. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Such is life. Have a good one. Stay safe. Ciao.